So without further ado, I'd like to start by bringing Barbara into the conversation. And Barbara's going to start by setting the scene around the context for leadership today. So Barbara, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian, and I was about to say good morning, everyone, but that's not going to work for all of you. It works for me. It's 9 in the morning here. Anyway, I'm very glad to be with all of you. I wish I could see your faces, better even to be with you physically as opposed to just virtually, but I will take what I can get. Thank you, Jillian, again for your comment and introductory notes. I will actually use as a jumping off point something that you started with, and I think that item that connected us in the first place, which is the level of dissatisfaction with the high level of dissatisfaction, the continuingly high level of dissatisfaction with programs in leadership learning, leadership development, whatever you want to call it. So I have been bothered by that for years. And Jillian mentioned one book that I wrote in direct response to that called Professionalizing Leadership. I will talk about that in my second block, but I have to say that every single thing I say, in effect, pertains to the issue of how we teach how to lead. And again, I am mystified, or as is implied even now in my comments, I am mystified by the fact that we do such a bad job of it, and that the level of trust in leaders, the level of satisfaction with leaders has been nothing but going down rather precipitously for the, let's say, 50 years, approximately 50 years of what I call the leadership industry. That is a weird trajectory, which is effectively that the more we teach how to lead, the less satisfied. Again, by the way, my comments on this pertain to the Western world, the leadership industry specifically. It is a curious trajectory. Again, the more we teach how to lead, the less satisfied is the general public, and specifically people in politics and business, with the effects, apparent or not, of what it is we do or what it is we say we do. So my first block of time is this one, and I've roughly titled it Things Change. Now, I'm not directly going to be speaking about how to teach how to lead in this block, but again, my comments pertain absolutely directly to that and should be understood in that context. So I will actually have in this block 3 triads. I like triads because the number 3 is not too much, it's not too little, and the items in it are therefore relatively easy to understand and indeed to not memorize, but to maintain. So my first triad is titled Leadership is Not a Person, it is a System. Now, excuse me, that's also the title of an article that I wrote for an MIT publication called Daedalus about a decade ago, and frankly, I've had no reason to change my mind. We tend to focus on the person at the top. We are obsessed with leaders, and by the way, there are good reasons for that, which I won't go into, but it is up to us who are experts in the field, or presumed experts in the field, to deviate away from that pattern, to get people to think more broadly, if you will, systemically, about leadership. So what are the components of what I call the leadership system? Once again, they are 3 in number. First, the leader. Never for a moment, having dismissed the all importance of the leader, never for one moment do I dismiss the importance of the leader. The person at the top, by the way, we could spend the entire hour and then some on definitions of leadership, of who is a leader, but I will simply refer to the person as the person at the top. The person at the top is, of course, of exceeding importance. Then, however, come the 2 other components of the leadership system. The second one is the person or persons that I call the follower. Now, I use the word follower, and I have insisted on doing that for 15, 20 years. simply because it is in English the obverse, the only antonym of leader. However, the way I use the word follower, again, a longer conversation, does not mean that followers necessarily follow. Think of the follower, if you dislike the word follower, think of the follower as stakeholders, as those who, or they can be employees, they can be constituents, whatever, as those others who a leader needs to bring along if he or she is going to be able to actually lead. So the follower is simply the other. So we have here the two components of the leadership system. We are missing still the third. The third is the contexts, plural, not enough to talk about the context, because the contexts consist of a series of, if you will, concentric circles. So the immediate context might be our organization, but the larger context would be the industry in which the organization is situated. The larger context would be the country, the culture, and so forth. In other words, a series of concentric circles, most of which, guess what, pertain. So what can we learn from that systemic approach to leadership? Very simply, it is not enough. It will not suffice to teach leaders, teach people who want to be leaders or want to be better leaders than they already are, simply to self-improve. They should self-reflect, they should self-analyze, they should learn how to negotiate, they should learn how to mediate, and so forth and so on. That will not do in the world in which we live. It is critical that leaders look at the other, at their followers, their constituents, again, whoever, and it is equally critical that leaders become contextually conscious, about which more in a few moments. My second triad. First triad is leadership is not a person, it's a system. My second triad, leaders' primary resources. What are the primary resources of a leader, and what did they say about how to lead in the year 2024, more generally at this moment in time? Again, there are three sources. You might think I'm reducing the entire world to triads. Well, maybe I am. Certainly for the purpose of this conversation, I am. The three sources are: one, power; two, authority; three, influence. So what's important to understand, and if I'm starting to talk a little faster, it's because I don't want to transcend my time block. What's important for you at this moment to understand, at least in my view, is that at this moment in time, in particular in the Western world, power has been diminished. The command and control model of leadership has gone out the window. We all understand that. Similarly, a leader's authority, generally associated with his or her credentials or his or her position, has equally been diminished. I often tell the story of how when I used to walk into a classroom at Harvard, I was addressed as Dr. Kellerman or Professor Kellerman. Now, just as likely, if not much more likely, students will address me as Barbara, even though I've never met them before. May seem like a small story, but it's indicative of the decline of authority, the collapse of the distance, certainly the shrinking of the distance between those at the top and those in the middle and at the bottom. Finally, there is influence. If I were a leadership teacher, which by the way, I am not, I teach about leadership. I do not teach, I repeat, I do not teach how to lead. But if I were teaching how to lead, I would focus on influence, on persuasion, which these days is much, much more valuable than either power or authority. And finally, I will simply turn to the third part of the original triad, which is context. Need to pay attention nowadays to context. Anyone who doesn't is going to be behind the eight ball for sure. Contextual awareness, the importance of understanding the importance of context. Contextual expertise, developing some expertise in what is the context. And then finally, contextual intelligence, how to apply what we know, what we have learned about context to the task of our ordinary business. I will close with this comment. the overarching context in which all of us are now living, whether in the West or in the East, North or South, business or government, education or religion, has dramatically changed even in the last 20 years. The most important changes are in culture. The most important changes are in technology. I will focus for 1 second on the second, which is technology. How have the changing technologies impacted on how leaders lead now, have been leading in recent times? And perhaps more to the point of this discussion, although I'm not sure, is how will technology, particularly AI, change the way leaders lead in the future? Final comment. In our prep for this session, which was brief but interesting, Frederick and I had a little bit of a disagreement on what a leader needs to know about technology in order to lead wisely and well. And I think it'll be interesting if in the next 45 minutes or so, that difference between us emerges. Thanks, Jillian, and I will now pass the baton back to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And I think I remember the very first conversation we had about leadership must have been back in about 2015. One of the things that really struck me at that time were your comments on followership. And I was doing a major piece of research on leadership at the time, and I didn't find anyone else who was really putting that front and center of our thinking about leadership. So I think that is so crucial. I'd love to come back perhaps later in the conversation when we talk a bit more about development to think about what should we be doing to actually develop the concept of followership in our organization. So maybe just seed that thought among our audience with you, Barbara. Maybe we'll come back to that later in the conversation. But for now, please do think about any reflections, any comments, any questions you might have based on what Barbara has just said. And now I'd like to sort of shift gear a little bit in the conversation and hand over to Frederick. So we have been working closely over the last few months to develop the simulation that I talked about that we ran last week in London. But as part of that, we were really reflecting on from our own research, but also discussing with other leadership experts in organizations to understand what are some of the challenges around leadership, and what are some of the success factors around effective leadership development? So, Frederick, do you want to share some of our conclusions on that? And clearly, I think we came up with 6. I mean, Barbara's also alluded to this. This is a vast topic. We have an hour, so we've had to be a little bit reductive. So, we hope you bear with us on that. But Frederick, over to you to share a little bit more about those findings.
Thank you, Jillian. So the name of the session is High Impact Leadership Development. So it's natural to ask the question, so what is that? And what we did was that we reviewed the research on the topic. We brought both from CRF and from BTS and from other sources. And then we brought 30 years of field work from our side to it. And then finally, we worked with these leaders as faculty from the CRF community to answer this question. And I'm not sure if there's any kind of wild new thoughts around it, but it's actually kind of nicely organized into at least 6 aspects that came up over and over again. And here they are. So the first one is aligned with business strategy. The really interesting part about this first one is that just 20 years ago, the time you could have a differentiation as a company was more than 3 times as long as what it is today. So organizations are shifting strategy, shifting operating models, shifting investments faster than what they've ever done before, which puts a lot more pressure on us in the leadership space to be able to build the leadership to both be able to do that with faster cycle times, but also making sure that what we are building is aligned with the latest business strategy and where we're going. The second thing that came up was a close partnership between talent, learning, and other HR functions. And some of the people were saying this is becoming harder at times because organizations have become increasingly siloed. And in many ways, also that has been made harder because we don't often sit together as much anymore. after COVID and with the hybrid ways of working. The third one is interesting because making tough choices on where and how to invest. It's easy to say, but very difficult to do, because there are a lot of stakeholders, there's a lot of people that want something, and there's only so much time and so much money. And I think Jenny Dearborn said it the best. Is one thing is to make the tough choices, but to have established your credibility in which the people accept the tough choices you make is something that's really important. So it's not just about making the decisions, but it's about ensuring that those people in the organization understand why and respect you for those decisions that have been made. One thing that came up many times is that we are really good at developing for what we need today, but not enough about the future skills. And it's hard because both we might not know what they are. We've seen how fast AI is moving, but a focus on the future as well as delivering on today. Gather experiences, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then, of course, linked to the leader on the job reality that they're experiencing and making sure we have a deep enough knowledge of what they're experiencing day to day. So I want to ask you in a poll, out of these ones, and Athena, if you start the poll, that'd be wonderful. Where do you see the biggest opportunity to increase the impact of leadership and development in your organization against these six? And in no ways are these six exhaustive, but these are the things that came up over and over again. So I'm curious to see. So you should all have a poll that's come up in front of you, and I see many of you have started to answer it already. We have about 60 people have answered now. Well, I'll give it another second.
Okay. Last chance to have your voice heard.
Last chance, 64 out of 85. I think we could call that statistically relevant enough. So here's, so you should all see the results on your screen. Now, what's interesting is that there's been a distribution across all of those, all of the ones that you said. So we have the one that has the most, looks to be balancing current and future needs of the organization. If anyone's daring enough to go on unmute and share why you picked that one, feel free. There's an open mic for a little second here. Or share in the chat if that feels safer. I'm going to take that as a no. So Jill, what's your reactions to seeing this? Are you surprised by this?
Well, I think this is very interesting, and the fact that there is a distribution across all of them, I guess is slightly heartening, because it suggests that we didn't get the wrong the wrong six things. If there was one that was at kind of 0%, then that might suggest we were off the mark there. Yeah, the future, balancing future and current needs of the organization. And it's really interesting because I think often this comes out in our research, is this challenge of not just for HR, but also for leaders to be looking far enough ahead. There's a huge bias for action and for immediate action in organizations that we certainly experience, and that does make it difficult to to maintain enough energy and focus on thinking further ahead. And even that forward thinking that does happen tends to be relatively short term. And I think, it also reflects on research that we've done around the role that HR leaders can play in developing organization strategy. And we think there is a big opportunity for HR leaders to step into that role as well, and perhaps to be playing a bigger role in either facilitating business strategy or even making an active contribution to the definition of that strategy. So I think it's heartening that that's seen as an opportunity for improvement.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And when we look at the next kind of closest one, is linked on the job reality, is the second most highest one, in enabling leaders to gather the right experiences. So clearly getting closer to the job is
Mm.
and getting people to get experiences on the job is still a challenge within the industry.
That's right. And we had a really interesting session a couple of months ago at IMD where we looked at learning innovation. And that was one of the trends that were really exploring in depth is how technology such as simulation, such as games, a lot of the AI technology offers a better chance to provide a personalized learning experience to individual leaders. So, again, reflecting the fact that that's a challenge for organizations, but it's also an opportunity that perhaps can be facilitated by many of the things that are coming over the line.
Yeah, and we do a lot of work in simulations. We've done for the last 30 years, and what we've experienced in the last years is that because the cycle of everything going faster, the traditional way of giving people experiences on the job is really difficult because that might take 3 to 5 years, and you don't have time for people to have all the experiences they need before they step into bigger roles. So if you can get approximations of those real life experiences in days instead of years, you can accelerate their wisdom and their vertical development around what they're able to, the complexity that they can cope with and navigate through this as a way of working. So it enables them to better understand the strategy faster and where they might make mistakes and experience it before it happens. But we've also seen that it helps talent teams to better assess readiness for the future and potential in people when you're seeing that the strategy is shifting and the organization is shifting fast, and just purely looking at today's performance is not enough. So.
Yeah.
But one thing we maybe should talk about is, like, we talked about what the function needs to do, but should we talk a little bit about what we see that leaders need to become better at in the futures? Because that's shifting too, and both of us are seeing. What are you seeing?
Absolutely. Well, we've done a lot of research around this, and in terms of understanding how the expectations, the role that leaders play is changing. And I guess I'd make a couple of observations. I mean, one is I think there's with the pace of change in the business context. Barbara talked about context, and a massive feature of context is the increasing pace of change. So that requires leaders to be to have a greater capacity for foresight, for seeing around corners, for being able to deal comfortably with, to help people make sense of ambiguity. There are no easy answers. There are no fast answers in the context that we operate in. So leaders have to be comfortable with that and have to be able to make decisions and give their followers vision, direction, and so on. So people know where you're heading. I think another aspect is the, while you have to make decisions and go in a particular direction, there also needs to be a degree of adaptability and responsiveness to that. So, we can't put all our chips on black and then, head sort of wholesale in that direction and hope that that's all going to work out. We do need to create strategies that are that can be experimental. We can make some steps forward in that direction and see how it goes and whether that's working. So we're not tied to something that's not going to be successful. There's a bit of a paradox here, though, because while leaders have to create some degree of flexibility and adaptability, there's also a requirement to maintain focused on a core purpose. So how do we have a purpose that's constant while at the same time being flexible enough to be able to try things out and respond as situations change? So I think that's a real core challenge for leaders. And then I think there's also something about developing the organization. So it's not just about where we're going to go to and what we're going to do, it's also how we're actually going to deliver on that. So creating cultures that are more experimental, more open to trying things out, are not necessarily looking for failure, but when things don't work out, they see that as an opportunity to learn and grow rather than something that is to be punished or discouraged or swept under the carpet. And that, we talk a lot about psychological safety as a kind of enabler of that. And so we hear a lot about that. So that would be just some, some observations from our work. How about you, Frederick?
I think very connected to what you're saying, seeing around the corners and what the future holds. I think the big elephant in the room is AI. And we need to talk about the impact that has on leadership and how it's massively disruptive already to today's leaders in the future. So I'd say that AI will not take jobs from humans, but humans who use AI will take jobs from humans who don't use AI. And companies whose employees use AI will beat companies whose employees don't use AI. So why does that matter then for leaders? Because leaders who use AI will then take jobs from leaders who don't use it. So these systems are becoming so extremely powerful, and they're so easy to use by anyone for on your own, but also for your competitors and everyone else. And they're only going to be more powerful for every day for the rest of our lives, which I think is pretty crazy to think about. So the AI we use today is the clunkiest version of AI that we'll ever use. It's like the first Motorola flip phone, if you think about it. That's how we'll look back at it now. And people will use it whether you tell them to do it or not, and your competitors will use it, and people in garages will be using it, who will be your competitors tomorrow. So the implications for leaders today are quite vast. It's not like in the past with new technology, it was okay to have experts on your team that would know that technology, but that's not the case anymore. To be AI literate doesn't mean that you're writing Python or TensorFlows, but that you understand how it works and what it can and cannot do for a couple of reasons. And the first reason is effective communication. So you need to be able to assess what other people are suggesting to do with AI without feeling like you're being intimidated on the back foot or mystified by it all the time. Or express your own ideas and unpack others' ideas without simultaneously have a translator in the room, if you like. And then the third one is like conversation with technical teams, lawyers, government officials about what you'd like to do with AI. So it's not enough to surround yourself with experts. It's almost like outsourcing that part. It's almost like now living in a country where you don't speak the language and you need to have a translator with you all the time. So we all have to embrace it, and we have to know more about it than we have had to know about previous technologies. The second reason is AI has a lot of risks, and there are biases, security issues, compliance issues, and the basic understanding of the systems is really important for you to be conversational about it and actually being able to make decisions around it together with experts. So you're not completely blanket, because that can, if you're a senior leader, that can topple you or not. And then the third aspect is what you said earlier, that the future back thinking aspect. Things are changing so fast that if you're trying to work your future back, short differentiation windows, we need to understand where we are today and how it will evolve in the future and what business opportunities that come up from that. So actually, AI skills is becoming a core leadership skill, which I would have never thought a year ago if you'd asked me. So it's a surprise.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable that the speed of evolution, and I think also, it goes right to the core of the business as well. Clearly leaders do need to be thinking about all these, understanding how it works and what the risks are inherent and the opportunities, but it's also, what does it do for our business model, and how do we need to adapt our core strategy? That's going to be a core element of business strategies going forward that will need to be so it will require leaders to have that deep understanding and expertise as well. And I guess the other aspect, Frederick, is that it will, and this is not just AI, but also we're seeing a lot of change in the practice of leadership development as well. So, for example, I mentioned before the learning innovation work that we've been doing with IMD, but we're seeing, for example, greater use of data and analytics to target personalized learning at the point and the time of need of that leader. Is becoming more and more relevant, creating more immersive learning experiences. We've been experimenting with VR, for example, virtual reality. We've seen examples of of AI, sort of learning bots that support kind of consolidation of learning. I know you've been developing in BTS coach bots, AI-driven coach bots, and so on. And then there's the challenge of aligning the learning and the work, which is that's nothing new. But how do we make sure that we use those day-to-day experiences, challenges that leaders face as they grow and develop as a vehicle, as an opportunity for learning? So it's not something that requires us to take a leader out of their context, kind of polish them up with some lovely new leadership skills and then transport them back into the situation they were in before. It's about, how do we link together learning and action in a more sort of joined up way?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things here that will happen. So I don't think it will go away, that need for exploring topics in discussion with others, in simulations or in workshops and so on. I don't think that would go away. I don't think practice will go away either. And I think AI enables us to do perfect practice because we can get feedback that doesn't have all the fears that humans will give each other or the poor practice around that. And we've seen really big impact on that when we've been using it. But I think the next stage is, a few years ago, we talked about learning in the flow of work. That was always clunky, but now we're able to do learning in the work. So if you've been learning influencing, for example, in these other settings, we now have the capability to do in the meeting like we're discussing now. If this was an influencing meeting, I can get a AI analysis of how well I was using these skills in my interaction with you. And get real-time feedback so I can actually address it before my next meeting, which is really, really good. So you're getting suddenly feedback in your real interactions from really good AI. And I think we'll just see more and more of that. And we're certainly doing more and more of that ourselves too.
Absolutely. Thank you. So thank you so much for all your questions so far. What we're going to do now is we're going to do our last, we're going to hand back to Barbara just to share some further thoughts about professionalizing leadership. And then we'd like to come back and really address those questions that you've put in the chat. So please do keep them coming in, and we'll hopefully get to as many of them as we can. Some really fascinating ones come through, and it's also an opportunity. So I can hand back to you, Barbara, and we'll give some thought to the questions as well while you're talking.
Thank you, Gillian. I'm going to try to, again, move as quickly as I can to leave maximum amount of time for collective conversation. I cannot resist piggybacking a little bit on what Frederick said, because I said earlier that he and I do not see the AI issue in exactly the same way. And I think it's fun for a larger group when some so-called experts do not see something in exactly the same way. So I would simply raise the generational issue. So many people in positions of power, authority, and influence are not 20-year-olds. They're not even 30-year-olds. In many cases, they're not even 40-year-olds. So the question is, what do we do with all those leaders who are not of a generation where they can possibly hope to understand as much about AI as Frederick would wish, and I might wish too, but I'm talking about getting real, not just for leaders in their 40s and 50s and 60s, but even for the younger ones who have so many demands on their intelligence, on their attention span. What exactly do they need to know about AI, and how much of that work would take away from their other responsibilities and obligations? So I would simply say, I don't disagree in a perfect world with what Frederick was arguing. I would simply say that in the real world, I think we need to be more nuanced about what it is we demand of leaders as it pertains particularly to AI. Okay, with regard to professionalizing leadership. So you heard earlier that I think we could do a much better job. I'll speak for the United States. I know the United States is not exactly the same as the rest of the Western world. There are differences, for example, between Europe and the US. However, I think some of these comments pertain across the board, and I think we see a high level of dissatisfaction in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, particularly now I am talking about our public sector leaders, and certainly in the United States. So I've commented initially about what I call the leadership industry, which I am part of. So when I comment negatively about it. I am absolutely biting the hand that feeds me. But I don't agree that leadership can be taught quickly and easily, and that leadership can be learned quickly and easily. And I compare it in this book, Professionalizing Leadership, to other professions. We do not treat leadership as if it were a profession. We don't even teach it as if it were a vocation, such as becoming an electrician or a hairstylist. We don't demand of leaders that they pass tests, that they take that they get a license, that they get credentials. In this country anyway, if you're going to be a hairstylist, you need a credential. If you're going to be an electrician or a plumber, you name it, not to speak of being a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, an engineer. A leader, we seem to send the message, take my course, come to my program, buy my book, and guess what? You too can learn how to lead. I don't think it happens that way, and neither, I might add, did the old timers, people such as Confucius, Plato, Machiavelli, who effectively thought it would take a lifetime to learn how to lead. Generic problems. Who exactly should learn how to lead? Are we democratizing this so that every undergraduate, for example, should take leadership courses? What are the criteria, if any, for someone who takes a leadership course or a leadership program? Who should teach how to lead? I can tell you in this country, lots of different people with lots of different credentials teach people how to lead, but should there be any criteria for that? Should there be a core curriculum? Should all people who learn how to lead learn some basics? Are there some general understandings that leaders should all equally be taught and all equally learn? Should there be a code of ethics? In other words, are there any minimal requirements for learning how to lead? My solution is not exactly rocket science. I steal it, frankly, I steal it from the professions. What I am arguing is that learning how to lead should resemble, not replicate, but resemble learning how to be a doctor, learning how to be a lawyer, learning how to be an engineer, a teacher, any other profession. What is the sequence in professional learning? It is very similar across the board, and I will give you the sequence. By the way, I use the word sequence advisedly. That is, it should be in order, in the sequence with which I'm going to mention it. Once again, it's a triad. I hope I'm not being reductionistic here, but that's what happens, for example, in medical schools. In order for a medical student to even cut into a cadaver, he or she must learn anatomy first. Okay, what's the sequence? First, leadership education, which is not learning how to lead. It is learning about leadership. There's an entire intellectual, purely cognitive intellectual curriculum for learning how to lead. So first, leadership education. Second, leadership training, which I would argue, or at least in my lingo, pertains to the conversation that we're having here, which is how do leaders get better, the skills leaders need, the talents they need, the gifts they need, the understandings they need in order to lead wisely and well. And the third one is leadership development, by which I mean nothing more complicated than the comparison to adult development, which means that you learn how to lead lifelong. The idea that this conversation, today's conversation, can simply be replicated in 5 years or in 10 years, or would have been identical to 5 years ago. We wouldn't have dreamt of using the term AI even 5 years ago, maybe not even 2 or 3 years ago. And now it's at the center of the conversation. So development means just the way a doctor has to keep on taking continuing education courses, ideally, so should leaders. In other words, again, the triad. First, leadership education. Second, leadership training, what I call training. Third, leadership development. And I will close my comments by reading a little bit of what I wrote from this book. I don't know if you can see it. It's the book, Professionalizing Leadership. And these are toward the end, comments I make toward the end of this book. This book, Professionalizing Leadership, is not about greatness or exceptionalism. It is not about heroes or heroines or leaders who are legends. Rather, it is about being good, about exercising good leadership by being ethical and effective. It is about educating, training, and developing cadres of leaders who are like cadres of doctors and lawyers. Most doctors and lawyers are not standouts, but because they have been well prepared, well educated, and trained, most are good at what they do, and some have become over time very good or even great. Most, in any case, are good enough for us generally to depend on them to perform as professionals and to act in a professional manner. Professionalizing leadership is not rocket science, but it does require that we reconceive leadership. It does require that we stop thinking of leadership as an occupation and start thinking of it as a profession entailing proper preparation and unremitting dedication. Once we take that leap, the rest is easy. My final line. This is, as I said, not rocket science, nor does it demand years of learning like a medical school. Every one of you listening to me today could adapt if you chose to. Even if you have very brief leadership learnings or programs or curricula, whatever it is, you could adapt the basic model of some leadership education. Let's say it's one day, 2 or 3 hours in the morning of leadership education, 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day of leadership training, and at the end of the day, conceiving of how leadership development, in other words, continuing learning, will be part of your overarching curriculum. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That's fantastically clear guidance. And I think what I was really struck by when we met last week was one comment I think you made in your remarks at our London event, which was, this is not high impact leadership development. It's not about achieving perfection, but it is about getting that little bit better. And I think what you've given us there is a framework that we can all use to think about how can we get a bit better in terms of how we think about leadership development, how we structure it within our organizations. So thank you very much for that real kind of clarity and call to action on that. I'd like to come back to, we've got some time now for questions. That the last sort of 10, 15 minutes of our time together, we're going to tackle the questions that you have or any points that you want to raise. The first question really goes back, Barbara, right to your comments about how leadership is changing and the shift away from power and authority towards influence, and a couple of sort of comments and questions. Amrutha has asked, what are the pros and cons of the shrinking distance between leaders and followers? And also Caroline has made a comment question that regardless of the future challenges of leadership, the present challenge is a lack of visibility and relatability. And Caroline's commented, senior leaders must effectively connect with their people, be curious, and demonstrate the behaviours they wish to see. Without that, there can be no moving forward. And I was kind of struck, putting those two things together, maybe there's a bit of a paradox playing out there where, in a way, the distance between leaders and followers has shrunk, but at the same time, there's still this perception that that leaders are not sufficiently visible, relatable, and exercising a degree of skill and expertise around communication, particularly that we might expect. So there's a question in there somewhere, I think, but I'd be interested.
I got it. I will address, there are really two questions, and I'll try to address them both quickly. The first is the pros and cons of the shrinking distance between leaders and followers. So about 10, 12 years ago, one of the books I wrote was The End of Leadership. And that book is great. I still love it, but I made one big mistake. The big mistake was that I assumed that shrinking distance was good because it was democratizing issues of leadership, followership, power, and authority. People, followers, as they have for at least since the time of the Enlightenment, have been getting a larger and louder voice. Great, I thought. What I did not then fully appreciate, and I explained, as I said, I think it's a really good book, but I would now change at least the ending. What I did not fully appreciate, and this is a nuance and a complexity, and if you do this stuff, you need to hold these complexities, sometimes two conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. That's the way leadership is. What can I tell you? The complexity is that if followers get too nasty, too emboldened, too entitled, too loud, too noisy, whether in a company or in a larger political group, that is not good for democratic leadership. It becomes chaotic. So there has to be a point in which the leader is going to draw the line between his or her role and that of the followers. Otherwise, you have a recipe. And I would add, for example, the turnover in the United Kingdom at the top of prime ministers in recent years is an example of that. Systems are not effective without reasonably good and stable leadership. The second question is about the relatability of leaders. Whoever asked that question, you have no idea how timely I think that is. I think leaders, and I would point to Rishi Sunak's, I'm bringing up some Brit examples because I think I'm talking to a largely Brit audience. Rishi Sunak's final press conference, the one where he announced that he was calling elections, which was held in the pouring, driving rain. I think in this country it was referred to 10 Downing Street, was an example of how out of touch. And by the way, Biden falls into this category. Trump falls into this category. To a degree, it's a generational issue, but not exclusively. Leaders don't get the issue. I don't know if one of you used the word, or Jillian, if it was yours, of relatability. They are on another planet. Rishi Sunak is on another planet. Joe Biden even, Trump even, on other planets. They are not relating, and that's one of the reasons why they are running into so much political trouble.
Thank you, Barbara. And then Frederick, in the chat, you've been sort of engaging with this, a slightly different angle on this idea of generational differences as well, and the leaders need to learn, but also there can be mutual learning between leaders and followers. If I'm sort of summarizing correctly what you're getting at, particularly with regard to technology, but also potentially with other aspects of effective leadership as well.
Yeah, I think we didn't talk about this earlier, but it's this skill of being able to work across the generations. It will be more and more important to do well, and it actually goes both ways. So it's when I say seniors, I talk about experienced people that are my age, I guess, and older, that have been in organizations for a while. They have this incredible organizational acumen, wisdom around how to get things done. That's really important. And then on the other hand, we now have new hires, graduates that are much more technically savvy than what we've ever experienced before, and might be the biggest experts in how to do things in new ways. So what we're seeing some of the most progressive companies doing out there is to be very deliberate about not just teaching the new hires how to effectively do their job within the organization, like the traditional things that we've done, but use them as a real resource for new ideas, new ways of working and such, but helping them, the new hires, to actually relate to the other generations in the workplace that they might see as dinosaurs or slow moving or frustrating because they see better ways of doing. But on the other side too, the leaders that have been there, how do they shift to learning mode with other generations and realize, hey, these are the areas we can help the new people, but here's the ways that I need to learn from them. And here's how the ways that this becomes a mutually beneficial relationship. So a lot more empathy work, and empathy is becoming kind of a superpower to be able to empathize and connect with different generations and people with very different backgrounds than you on an effective and quick way.
Thanks, Frederick. And I think the other word that was going through my head as you were talking is the concept of apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. And leaders from one generation to the next learning from each other and passing on those skills, those nuances, their experience. And it also relates to the idea of learning through experience. So accumulating an experience, passing it on and working on it together with someone who's more experienced. And actually it's interesting because David's raised the question about leading a remote workforce, and what that means for traditional leadership skills. Does it make them even more important, or does it require the development of completely new capabilities? And sort of thinking about that as well. You know how that side-by-side apprenticeship type learning is harder when you're not physically present together. So just be interested to hear your perspectives on the increasingly remote workforce and what that means for leadership requirements and leadership development.
Yeah, and maybe if I go first with what you're saying around apprenticeship, we've all heard about like reverse mentorship, which like many companies are doing. One of the CEOs we're working on, he has created a reverse apprenticeship. So he has one of the graduates apprenticing him, and then he's also apprenticing them back on other things. So it's so that's kind of a new twist on that. So this acknowledgement that I need to learn at the speed in which I've never needed to learn before, and you might be the best person to apprentice me on it. The second thing, I think that around kind of remote workforce, I think empathy, connection becomes even more important, and the ability to take time and do that in a digital space. We see those leaders who are really showing up as their whole person in the digital realm. They are doing so much better with their reports. So I think to David's note, it almost heightens the empathy, connection, influence style of leaderships of seeing, hearing the people that you work with while still being able to hold the expectations and performance conversation.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit like when you give a presentation, you have to deliberately slow down your pace of speech and be much more deliberate and about how you speak and how you enunciate. So you can perhaps draw parallels with that around things like empathy. You have to be so much more deliberate about showing empathy and other capabilities that are going to be more important in the virtual space. Barbara, just any thoughts from you in terms of remote leadership? Is that something you've been looking at in your work?
I would simply say, Gillian, that in the United States, it is now somewhere in between. In other words, it's the hybrid model that seems to dominate. If I were running an organization, I would try very hard not to have it entirely remote, unless it's maybe a particular kind of work. One has to be very careful of blanket statements. But I think we're learning more. I mean, this is still, the pandemic was just a few years ago. And it was it that changed the 5-day work week to now a dominantly, I think it's over 50% of organizations in the United States that are doing the work, requiring people to come in typically 2 and 3 days a week, maybe 4, but not 5, not 9 to 5 old model. And I think we're still learning a lot, but I believe that which we are learning, I think in this sense, I agree with what both of you have said, the virtues of face-to-face contact and the virtues of replicating and I found this when I taught during the pandemic remotely, the closer you can replicate the online experience to the face-to-face experience, I think generally speaking, you're better off. As you said, Gillian, we tend to slow down a little bit more online, so forth and so on. Things are lost. I think wit and humor are things that are not easily, or at least not so easily replicated online. But in general, the more we are in the end social creatures. And that is the human condition is one of being social. And the more we can replicate the face-to-face experience, whether in real life, we don't have to replicate it, but online, I think in general, the better we are learning from the research that the better off we are.
Fantastic. Really, really great observations. Thank you for that.